Okay, hello chaps, this is a video on supply side policies. So supply side policies, to give them their full definition, are policies that seek to improve the long run productive potential of the economy. What we mean by long run productive potential, that refers mostly to that YFE concept we've looked at, that level of output that occurs when all resources, all factors of production are fully employed in our economy. What we're going to see now, we're going to see some diagrams to show an increase in this long run productive potential using a PPF and an ASAD diagram. So for the PPF, we're going to have capital goods on one axis, consumer goods on the other, and we're going to see our PPF shift outwards in all directions to show that now, given our resources, we can now produce a greater amount of output from them. And to show this in an ASAD diagram, we've got price level and our real national output. There's our first AS curve, there's our first AD curve. We're going to see an extension, an increase in aggregate supply from AS0 to AS1. And we'll see our level of output that corresponds from full employment, increasing from YFE0 to YFE1. We have then two types of supply side policies. We have market-based supply side policies, and these are ones that allow the free market to operate with the government reducing its role in the market. So we're letting the market operate more freely, letting output get increased as firms are free to make decisions in line with supply and demand. And we have interventionist supply side policies, and this is where the government acts to correct market failure and increase supply where the market has failed to produce the maximum level of output. So we're going to look at the importance of supply side policies. For the British economy, there are several reasons why supply side policies are so important. They provide a platform for long-term economic growth. If we only have increase in aggregate demand, we're just going to get inflation in the long run. We're not going to see any increase in in output beyond YFE. They imply better productivity and greater living standards. Now we can make more output per worker. There's more goods to go around for every worker. It allows the economy to grow without inflation. If we only have AD, as I said earlier, we're only going to get inflation. So by increasing aggregate supply, we can get increase in output without that same inflationary pressure that we saw in our demand side policies. We get more competition, lower prices, and this is good for consumers. They can consume more, so we have gains in welfare. They make UK goods more competitive in global markets because they allow prices to fall relative to other countries, and so we can export more because they're more price competitive. And we see an increased tax revenue for the state as there's greater output being made, more profits for firms, and therefore more tax can be charged on those profits. And it's the same for workers' income. The workers are going to be seeing greater incomes, and therefore the government can generate more tax revenue off those higher labour income. However, we do have some general evaluations to these benefits. As said, there might be knock-on effects. Supply side policies, which involve government spending, for example, may also increase the aggregate demand curve. As we're going to see in a second, one type of supply side policy that involves government spending is spending on education and training. And obviously, whilst they'll increase aggregate supply, that's going to be an increase in G as well. So there might be some inflationary effects, certainly to start with. Unemployment. In the short term, we might see unemployment as capital may well replace workers if firms are replacing their workers. If firms are investing lots in new capital, they're going to perhaps lay off some workers, and we might see some unemployment. There will also be a time lag, perhaps. A lot of these policies to increase aggregate supply may take a few years to come into effect and to really see that increase in productive potential. And there might also be government failure. So linking back to what you've done in theme 1, the government may not necessarily spend wisely and efficiently on its projects. We may not necessarily see as great an increase in aggregate supply as we might think when implementing a policy. There have been historically a number of cases of poorly administered government supply side policies which have not had the desired outcome, that desired outcome being an increase in aggregate supply. So I'm going to look at a couple of examples of supply side policies, and our task for the following examples is to categorise them into whether they are market-based supply policies or whether they are interventionist supply side policies. So the first one we're going to look at is privatisation, and this is the transfer of inefficient state-owned firms into the private sector. The explanation for this, the reason the government does this, is because in transferring ownership to the private sector, it opens the firm up to market discipline, creates that profit motive that perhaps a government firm wouldn't respond to, and therefore firms have an incentive to cut costs and raise productivity, and therefore increase output and aggregate supply. Famous examples of this in the UK in the past: we've seen BT become privatised, we've seen British Gas become privatised, and we've seen a lot of the railways also become privatised. That means they were run by the government. However, in the 70s in particular, they were quite inefficient. A lot of them were sold off to private firms, opening them up to that market discipline, creating that profit motive, as these new firms are going to try really hard to increase their profits, going to try and cut their costs, increase their productivity, and therefore see an increase in aggregate supply. To evaluate these, though, however, as I said earlier, we saw all of these in the 1970s, but nowadays in the 21st century, there aren't very many government-owned, publicly owned firms left in operation, as most of them would have been sold. So it brings into question how much we can still continue to use privatisation as a way of generating supply, increasing aggregate supply. There is perhaps some debate there about whether the NHS could be privatised in future. However, any movement to do so would likely be met with quite a strong opposition. Furthermore, privatisation may only see a state-owned monopoly become a privately owned monopoly. What that means is where there's only one, where the market only supports one firm, if it's run by the state, it's likely to be targeting increases in welfare. However, if it's run by a private company, if it's the only firm, as we'll see in theme 3, this firm will have scope to push prices up. And if it's pushing prices up, that can impact the welfare of consumers, as they're now consuming less and paying more for what they do consume. We have deregulation and competition policies, and these are policies which act to remove legal restriction on businesses and encourage competition. Essentially, they make it easier for new firms to start operating. And this increased competition by allowing more firms to join the market. That means firms are forced to be more productive, to try and cut costs and then lower prices and boost output in our economy as they're trying to compete with other firms for those customers. However, to evaluate a possible disadvantage of this is that now with multiple firms, there might be a waste of money on advertising, there might be excessive choice, there might be quality concerns, and perhaps these are less likely with fewer firms. And so increasing our competition may lead to these spillover effects, so less likely with fewer firms. Another supply side policy could be reducing corporation tax, and that's where corporation tax is a tax, of course, on business profits. So by cutting corporation tax, we're going to leave firms with more leftover profit to invest. That's going to increase the quantity of factors of production because they're going to be buying new capital, or it could increase the productivity of their capital as the firms implement more research and development to try and improve, try and cut their costs. So they're going to cut their costs, increase their supply, and then if every firm does this, that will increase the aggregate supply as well. However, if we're letting firms keep more of their profits, there is no guarantee that that money will be spent on new investment. So perhaps an alternative, rather than cutting corporation tax, would be to give R&D tax credits instead. So rather than cutting the rate of tax, what we'd say to firms is, if you invest, you'll pay a bit less tax. So that's how governments try and get around that limitation there of reducing corporation tax. Some more examples then. Education and training. Increasing the quantity and quality of education and training available to workers within a country. If this happens, people become more productive. The product of their labour goes up. Essentially what we're seeing, the factor of production that we're concerned with is labour. And with more education and training, we see greater quality. And those better workers can produce more output. We're going to see an increase in YFE and an increase in aggregate supply as well. However, there can well be a time lag while people train. Imagine a scenario where the government say every school child will get an extra year of nursery school before they start their primary education. If that happens, yes, that extra year of schooling will improve their outputs when they join the labour force, but it's going to be 15 odd years for a lot of those students to get into the labour force. So a key limitation there is the time lag. Work visas and immigration, improvements in the ease of immigration into an economy from overseas. So this is making it easier for workers to come over from overseas, particularly for those high-skilled workers. That's one of the key aims of the government after Brexit, is to try and move that point-based immigration system where they're getting lots of high-skilled workers from overseas to come over. By doing this, we get an increase in the quantity of labour, and perhaps even an increase in the quality of labour if those top-end high-skilled workers, as we mentioned earlier. And that's, of course, a factor of production is labour. And so with greater labour, greater quantity, greater quality of labour, we're going to see an increase in our YFE again and an increase in our AS. However, the key limitation to that is if the other factors of production are not sufficient, there could just be increases in unemployment. If we get lots of foreign plumbers over, for example, there could just be lots of British plumbers who are more expensive who are now out of work, and that will lead to greater unemployment for them because they're replaced by the cheaper alternatives from overseas. So whilst we may have greater output, there might be other costs, other macroeconomic objectives that are no longer being met. Labour market reforms as well. So this is to do with reducing the power of trade unions. Trade unions set wages for workers or act as a bargaining body for workers to demand higher wages. By reducing the power of trade unions, this is the idea is it will boost the productivity of labour as staff will spend less time on strike and therefore more time in work. And also because the unions are no longer in a position to make unreasonable wage demands, there would actually be a decrease in the cost of production as well. Maybe a shift in the S graph if you're using the classical model, or a shift down of the AS curve if you're using the Keynesian. So for Keynesian, the effects of labour market reforms might look a bit like this. As we go from AS0, we get an increase because workers, a shift to the right, because workers are spending less time out of the workplace on strike, and a shift down as the trade union is now less powerful. They can't demand as greater wage increases as they have done in the past. The key evaluation of this is that if you take away these trade unions from the workers, that could have quite a demoralising, quite a demotivating effect. And it could be that the workers, because they're getting paid less, because their quality of work, of workplace has gone down, they might work less hard, they might produce less. Their output per worker might actually go down because they are less productive. So going on from that then, just to outline our task for this week, your first task is to make notes based on this video. So go back and watch it again, make sure you're making notes. And perhaps you could use the question prompts in the pack as outlined to help you make those notes. Once you've made your notes, we'd like to upload your notes to your class notebook area on OneNote. Each set should have their own class notebook, and either upload your notes typed or as a PDF printout of scans or pictures of your handwritten notes. Your next task is to complete MCQs via Microsoft Forms, and that link there is provided. It's also in your Word document task, your Word document pack for the week. In that pack, there's also the worksheets. Again, upload these to your OneNote as with your class notes. And then finally, you'll have essay tasks to get on with at the end. Only type your essays, please, if you would use a laptop in your exams. If you handwrite, please stick to handwriting your notes and upload them either as scans or pictures as a PDF printout to your OneNote. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. I gather this is our first proper use of the electronic learning service after your mocks. Let's take it as it comes. Feel free to ask lots of questions to any of us in department.